welcome to session 5 of Unit 2. And in this session, we'll be looking at writing specific lesson objectives. My name is Patrick Ejay. Now, at the end of this session, you should be able to define a lesson objective, describe the categories of a good lesson objective, describe the components of a good lesson objective, write good lesson objectives in the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains of human behavior, and state the advantages of writing lesson objectives and mention the limitations of writing lesson objectives. So, what is a lesson objective? So, I know students are thinking that it gives us what the learners should be able to do, and that is good. So let's take a lesson objective. And it is a statement which indicates the kind of behaviors which a student should be able to exhibit as a result of the lesson that you as a teacher, you will plan for the student. And it describes what the student should be able to know, what the student should be able to do or believe at the end of a lesson. And they are stated in specific or behavioral terms so that they can be measured or assessed. That is one key feature of lesson objectives. And sometimes these lesson objectives or the specific lesson objectives are referred to as instructional objectives, performance objectives, behavioral objectives, or learning objectives. All these are used to describe specific lesson objectives. Now, what are the characteristics of a lesson objective? So, for lesson objectives, it should be student-oriented. And when we say it is student-oriented, then we are saying that it should focus attention on the student and not the teacher. So, let us take this example. It will be incorrect to say that at the end of the lesson, the student will be exposed to Ohm's law. Now, who does the exposition? You realize it is the teacher. So here, the focus is on the teacher rather than the student. And so the correct way of stating such an objective is that the student will be able to state Ohm's law. Another characteristic of a lesson objective is that it should be precise. And when we say it should be precise, what we mean is that it must state exactly what the student should be able to do. And so an incorrect form of an objective which is not precise is that the student will be able to identify the sources of energy. How many sources should the student identify? And so to be precise, the correct form of this objective should be the student will be able to identify 5 or at least 3 sources of energy. Then another characteristic of a lesson objective is that it should be unambiguous and observable. That is, it should be capable of being measured. And so an example here, when we state an objective such as the student will be able to know a stationary wave, to what extent must the learner know? You realize that such an objective is not measurable. So for us to be able to measure, then the correct form of such an objective can be the student will be able to define a stationary wave. So these are the characteristics of a good lesson objective. Now let us look at the categories of lesson objective. And a lesson objective may fall under one of 3 categories or domains of human behavior. And these are the cognitive, the psychomotor, or the affective. And so we will be looking at cognitive domain objectives. That is, objectives in the cognitive domain. And here, these objectives relate to intellectual abilities or thinking skills, such as recognition, recall or memorization, comprehension, as being used in the cognitive domain. And so let's take these examples. The student will be able to, one, distinguish between transverse and longitudinal waves. Two, state Kirchhoff's laws. Three, define thermal capacity. So you could see that all these verbs are being used and they all talk about the cognitive domain. Now let's look at the psychomotor domain objectives. And these objectives reflect motor skills as well as hand-eye coordination. And they describe performances at task. So what the learner should be able to do. And in this domain, verbs such as adjust, draw, sketch, connect, etc. are all used in this domain. So example, the student will be able to calibrate a voltmeter. So the task that the student should be able to do at the end of the lesson is to calibrate a voltmeter. The student will be able to draw a diagram showing the parts of the human eye. And the last one, measure the diameter of wires using a micrometer screw gauge. All these are objectives in the psychomotor domain, and they describe the task that the learner should be able to perform at the end of going through a set of instructions. Now let's look at the affective domain objectives. And this objective deals with attitudes, interests, beliefs, feelings, and values. And they use words such as state. So you can state one's opinion, ask, you can ask questions, verify, explain. So you can explain one's position, choose, discuss. These are verbs that can be used in the affective domain. And examples of objectives under the affective domain include the following. The student will be able to, one, show interest in nuclear energy by reading about nuclear waste. Two, ask questions on the topic treated. Then three, propose a project topic to be investigated. Now you observe that the verbs are being used in almost all the three objectives that has been stated. That is, there are some verbs that are being used at the cognitive, at the affective, as well as the psychomotor domains. Now, what are the components of a lesson objective? So a good lesson objective usually has the following components or parts. So every good lesson objective must have a performance component, and this specifies the observable behavior that the student is to exhibit as a result of the teaching learning process. And there should also be a content, and this talks about the component that is to be learned. And there must be a condition component, and the condition component is sometimes called the testing situation. And this one specifies the situation under which the learning outcome will be assessed and what the student will be given or denied. And the final component is the criterion or the standard, or what others refer to as the qualifier. And this component specifies the minimum level of acceptable performance that the student will be expected to exhibit. So now, let us take an example to show the various components we just discussed. So the first example, the student will be able to define energy. So the performance component is defined and the content is energy. The next example, the student will be able to define energy in his or her own words. So the performance is to define, the content energy, and the condition is in his or her own words. And the last example, with the aid of a diagram, the student will be able to describe the functions of at least 5 parts of the human eye. And so the performance term here is described. The content talks about functions of parts of the human eye. The condition is with the aid of a diagram, and the criterion is at least 5. So we must take note of these components. Now, what is the format for writing a lesson objective in lesson plans? So anytime we are writing our lesson plan, we state objectives. So what is the format? And in lesson plans, we start objectives by the statement, by the end of the lesson, students or the students should or will be able to, then the objectives will now follow. So let's take an example using the topic energy. And so by the end of the lesson, students will be able to 1. Define energy in their own words. 2. State at least 3 sources of energy. 3. Distinguish between renewable and non-renewable sources of energy. Then list 6 forms of energy. And finally, explain how energy is converted from one form to another in their everyday lives. Now, when you check all these objectives, you realize that they are all specific, they are precise, and they are unambiguous. What are the advantages of writing lesson objectives? And so you as a teacher, it helps you to identify what is to be taught. It helps you to select appropriate teaching learning strategies and techniques for your lesson. It also helps you in the selection of appropriate teaching learning resources. It helps to determine what, when, and how to assess your students. What are the limitations of writing lesson objectives? So although we are seeing a whole lot of advantages that writing of lesson objectives present to us, but there are some disadvantages. And it is time consuming to write. And secondly, they make some teachers inflexible in teaching, because this is what they have stated, and by hook or crook, they want to achieve those objectives in their lesson. Now, students, in this session, we looked at how to write good lesson objectives and the categories of lesson objectives, as well as the components of lesson objectives. Now, as we bring the session to an end, let us take this as a take home. Define lesson objective, state 2 characteristics of a good lesson objective, and list the components of a lesson objective. I hope you enjoyed this session.
Thank you. I have been your course facilitator, Nihad Goni, and see you in our next session.